the record for us.
Sarah Zadovich, SARAZYDOWICZ.
Thank you. You may inquire.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Can you tell us, what do you do for a living?
I'm a forensic pathologist.
And who do you work for?
I work for Orange County. We cover Orange County and Osceola County.
And how long have you been a forensic pathologist?
I've been at this office for about 12 years and then 1 year in Tampa, so about 13 years.
And what type of educational background do you have to be a forensic pathologist?
So I have a bachelor's degree in kinesiology from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I went to medical school in Kansas City, Missouri. After that, I went to Cleveland, Ohio to do a 1 year rotating clinical internship. After that, I went back to the University of Wisconsin. I did my residency in anatomic pathology and clinical pathology. I have 2 fellowships or subspecialty training. One is in cytopathology from Northwestern University in Chicago. And then I did my forensic pathology fellowship in Tampa.
Is continuing education something that you must maintain in order to hold your position?
Yes, I have to do continuing education for my board certifications, which is in anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, and forensic pathology. Our goal is to determine cause of death and manner of death in those individuals that we're investigating.
Could you tell us what an autopsy is, generally speaking?
So an autopsy is also called a postmortem or after-death examination. And there are kind of 2 main parts to it. The first part is what's called an external examination, which is just as it sounds. So that's making observations about an individual. So hair color, eye color, height, any sort of unique markings like scars or tattoos. And at that time, we're also looking for any external signs of diseases or injuries. After that, we go to what's called the internal examination. So that means that we open the body cavities, we remove all of the organs, and dissect all of the organs. And again, as we're doing that, we're looking for any signs of diseases or injuries that might help explain why that person died. And we can also add ancillary tests or other tests, so things like toxicology, microbiology. It's a little bit dependent on each case, but we have options for other testing as well.
Can you tell us what is the cause and manner of death, and is this something that you document?
Yes, so cause of death is either a disease or an injury that ultimately results in an individual's death. Right? So it's very individual and unique to that individual. Manner of death is a way to categorize or group similar types of deaths together. And for manner of death, there's only 5 choices. So there would be natural, accident, suicide, homicide, or undetermined. So those are the manners of death.
In your career, approximately how many autopsies have you performed?
Around 3,000.
And have you previously testified as an expert witness in court?
Yes.
How many times?
Between 75 to 80.
And in what areas have you testified as an expert witness?
Forensic pathology.
Turning our attention to this case, did you perform the autopsy?
Yes.
And what were your findings as to cause and manner of death?
So the cause of death, which I put on the death certificate, is positional asphyxia with environmental suffocation. And the manner of death I classified as homicide.
Now, when you perform your autopsy, what information do you have at the time that you begin that examination?
It's incredibly variable. I can have a lot of background information. Sometimes I have none. It just depends on the particular case.
In this case, what information were you provided ahead of time?
So the information I had was that the decedent was with his girlfriend, and at some point in time in the night, he got into a suitcase, which was then zippered shut. At another point at time, I believe she went to bed, and then the next morning discovered that he was still in the suitcase. And I think that was in about an 11-hour time frame from the information that I had.
mentioned asphyxia. Can you explain for us what asphyxia is?
Sure. So asphyxia is a very general term. It would be kind of like saying, I drive a car, right? That's very generic. And we know that there are many different types of cars out there, right? So asphyxia simply means lack of oxygen or inadequate oxygen for an individual. And there are different categories of asphyxia. So you can have suffocation, which just means that there's obstruction of the airways. So that could be smothering, that could be somebody choking on a piece of food, or maybe just being in an environment where there's not enough oxygen in the air to sustain that individual. There's a category called strangulation. That would be compression of the neck, either blood vessels or airways. There's another category called mechanical asphyxia. That can be when the body is in an unusual or abnormal position where the actual mechanics of breathing can't occur. So that can be the position of the body, or it can be, like, let's say if a heavy object fell on somebody and you simply can't breathe because of the weight of that object. That would be a mechanical asphyxia. And then there's drowning. That's a different type of asphyxia. And there are a couple of other categories as well that are much less common.
Is there a most common type of asphyxia?
The most common would be ligature compression of the neck. So that would be like an event, a hanging. That would be the most common that we would see.
You also mentioned environmental suffocation. Could you tell us a little bit more what that means in more layman's terms?
So that just means that there's not enough oxygen in the environment that the person is in. You could think of somebody who's in an enclosed space where there's a fixed amount of oxygen. So as that oxygen is, as that person is breathing, they're using up all the oxygen. And once it's gone, there's no oxygen left. Or you could think of maybe people who are, climbing Mount Everest. There's not as much oxygen up there, and that's why they have oxygen tanks. So it just means that the amount of oxygen available in the air around that person is not enough to sustain them.
In this case, what can you tell us about how long George Torres was in that suitcase?
There's not a really good way for me to give you a time frame as to how long he was in that suitcase. Again, because there was both the component of positional asphyxia, being in an unusual position for a period of time, and then also the environmental suffocation component. Because within that suitcase, certainly there's going to be oxygen, but it's not going to be the same as if you were sitting in a room like this. And because there are those multiple components happening at the same time, there's not a really good way to estimate or say with scientific certainty, oh, he was in for X amount of time. There's really not a good way to do that.
How about, is there any good way to approximate or determine the time that George Torres died?
There's not a good way to do that either, again, because there are so many different components at play at the time of his death. Sitting in a normal room like this, the percentage of oxygen that's available is about 20 to 21%. If that were to drop to 10 to 15%, the person can be impaired with judgment, they can be impaired with activity. Once that percentage drops between 8 to 10%, most people will lose consciousness. And at a percentage of 8% oxygen or less, that's when we would expect the death to occur. And so again, there's not a really good way to measure the amount of oxygen that would have been available to him in that suitcase, in addition to the fact that he was in an unusual position.
What position were you able to determine he was in that suitcase?
I wasn't able to see what position he was in. By the time that our medical legal death investigators were at the scene, he was already removed from the suitcase. Based on some of the findings, I favor that he was most likely in like a fetal type position. So knees flexed, arms flexed, and the head most likely flexed forward. But again, that's from my findings. I didn't see what position he was in.
What side of his body would he be resting on in this fetal position?
That most likely his left side. However, I do say the caveat that some of the findings are dependent on time, meaning that, if that suitcase had been moved or flipped over, that could be different than what I'm seeing at the time of my examination.
Tell us, what is skin slippage?
So after death, the body goes through a series of progressive changes. And one of those changes is skin slippage. And what that does is it tells me that that person is a little bit further away from the actual time of death. So it's not something that's going to occur immediately after death for most people. It's something that would occur a little bit later on in that process of changes that happens after death.
And tell us, what is rigor mortis?
So rigor mortis is also called the post-mortem stiffening of muscles. And again, that's one of the changes that occurs after death. Most of the times that will occur before we see skin slippage. But these changes are very variable from individual to individual. And it also depends a lot the environment the person is in. So for example, those changes that we're going to see happen more quickly in a warm environment. Somebody who maybe is engaged in a physical or violent struggle, those changes are going to occur more rapidly. And then it also depends on the person themselves, their relative size, their relative health. Those things can all impact the changes that we see after death.
How does skin slippage and rigor mortis inform your findings about how long George Torres was likely in that suitcase?
So again, the time frame that I had was about 11 hours, just from the last time that he was known to be in the suitcase versus the time that he was found. So I'm basing it off of that. So about an 11-hour time period. When I did my examination, the rigor mortis was already dissipating or leaving. Also, there was some skin slippage. And so if he had not been in the suitcase, if he had been out of the suitcase, I would not expect that advanced amount of change. It's compatible with him being in that suitcase for a longer period of time. It would have been warmer. And also if he had been, struggling to get himself out, engaging that physical activity, those are things that are going to accelerate or speed up that process. So my findings at the time of the examination are compatible with that 11-hour time period or, somewhere around there.
Additionally, did you note any injuries to the body of George Torres?
Yes.
These injuries that you noted to the body of George Torres, did you document them on what's called a body chart?
Yes, the diagram on a body chart, and we also take pictures as I'm going through my examination.
Your Honor, may approach the witness who has been previously marked for identification and shown to defense as states R.
You may.
You recognize this document?
Yes.
And can you tell us, what is this document?
That's a copy of my body diagram.
Your Honor, at this time I'd like to move what's previously been marked for identification as states R into evidence. No objection.
What was pre-marked as states R will be received into evidence without objection as states 12.
So, ma'am, on this body chart, can you describe for us and point out what was the first blunt impact injury that you identified?
So there were some blunt impact injuries to his head. I don't think it's on this one, but there were some blunt impact injuries to his head right up here around the eye and on the mouth area.
And then, did you notate any injuries to his hand?
Yes, so there were some ecchymoses, or you can think of that as like a large kind of bruise on both hands.
What other blunt impact injuries did you identify?
So there was a series of ecchymoses on the left side of the back, which right about here.
And any others?
There were some on the forearms as well.
And You use this body chart, you say, in addition to photographing the injuries that you document, correct?
Yes.
As part of your examination, and I believe it's on the body chart itself, do you document the height and weight of the person as well?
Yes.
And what was the height of Mr. Torres?
So technically for us, it's length. Height is the measurement that's taken while someone is standing. So his length was 62 inches, and his weight was 103 pounds.
In regards to these blunt impact injuries, how is it that you come to the conclusion that these injuries were the result of blunt impacts?
So these are typical wounding patterns for blunt force trauma. And when I say blunt force trauma, that can mean something striking a part of the body, or on the other hand, it can be the body striking an object. And that causes injury to the skin, and to the soft tissue, and sometimes the deeper tissues, depending on how severe or how strong that blunt force trauma is.
Are these injuries consistent with a person being struck with a baseball bat?
They could be, yes.
Are they consistent with a person being pushed down a flight of stairs?
They could be, yes.
Can you say whether or not these injuries occurred while George Torres was in the suitcase?
No.
Why is it that you cannot say that?
So all of these injuries seem to have occurred around the same time, meaning that they're relatively acute or new. They're not things that are healing or something that happened last week. So they all occurred around the same time. But you can't really look at a bruise or a contusion and say, oh, that happened 2 hours ago. There's not a good way to do that.
Are these injuries consistent with them occurring while he was inside the suitcase?
Yes, they could be.
As part of your examination, do you also check the toxicology of George Torres?
Yes.
And is that something that's pretty standard in any autopsy?
Yes.
And what were the toxicology results for George Torres?
So there was a blood alcohol level of 0.139 milligrams per deciliter, and there was also caffeine and nicotine detected as well.
That level of alcohol, is that over the legal limit in the state of Florida to drive?
Sure. So for driving under the influence, that's a 0.08. So that is higher than that.
What does that alcohol level at the time of your autopsy tell you about George Torres's level of impairment 11 hours earlier?
So I don't necessarily know that it was 11 hours earlier, but it was at the time of death, at or near the time of his death. That's what the blood alcohol level was. So at that level, everyone reacts a little bit differently to alcohol, and some of it has to do with whether or not somebody is accustomed to drinking alcohol or if they've never had alcohol. So you can develop tolerance. But at that level, there's going to be impairment of judgment. There can be impairment of motor skills. There can be slurring of words. Something that's called disinhibition or lack of inhibition. And again, it's really variable from person to person, but those are the common things that you would see at that level.
Would that level of alcohol impair the ability to problem solve?
It can, yes.
You also stated earlier that you document your autopsy findings also photographically, correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness who's been marked for identification as State's Q and been shown to defense?
You may.
Ma'am, do you recognize these photographs?
Yes.
Are these photographs a portion of the photographs that you took in your autopsy of George Torres in this case?
Yes.
Request permission to publish.
You may do so.
showing you photo 1 from State's composite. Tell us, what is this a photo of?
So this is the identification photo that's basically just showing from about the level of the collarbones up.
And this is George Torres.
Yes.
Did you note any signs of injury in this photo?
So there's some ecchymosis around the left eye. This picture, it's a little bit hard to see, but I think there's another one coming up. There's also an area of ecchymosis up here on the left side of the forehead with also some swelling associated with that. The lips have some contusions and small lacerations. And then on the left shoulder here, you can see a little bit of some ecchymosis here. Or again, ecchymosis are kind of like big bruises.
Turning to photo 2 from State's composite, what are we looking at in this photograph?
So this is his right arm near the elbow. And right here you can see this kind of darker area. So this looks similar to an abrasion, but it's actually, it's what's called drying artifact. And again, this is one of the reasons that I think that he was in that suitcase for a little bit longer. Most likely that was a pressure point where part of that suitcase was resting on his elbow in that area. And then after death, that tissue dries out, and that's the discoloration that you're seeing there.
Turning to States 3 from the composite.
So here you can see a little bit better. I don't know if you can get a feeling for this, but this area is what we call edema or swelling. So this whole area is edema. It's a little bit discolored, so ecchymosis. And then again, really at the corner of the eye here, you can see that darker discoloration. And so those are injuries from blunt force trauma.
States 4 from the composite.
So this is the left shoulder and arm. So again, you can see this kind of red to purple area. So this is all ecchymosis, and then a couple of linear abrasions or scratches.
States 5 from the composite.
This is the same area, just a little bit closer up, so you can see this whole area of ecchymosis. It's a little bit variegated, differential in color, but again, that's all blunt force trauma.
And what part of the body is this we're looking at?
This is the left shoulder.
States 6 from the composite.
That's the same area, but in this picture we have a scale or the ruler.
And why do we use scales and rulers?
That's just to give an idea of how big the area is or how large the injury is.
States 7 from the composite.
So this is the left forearm and hand, and you can see the area right here that's a little bit red to purple, and then also right here on the left hand, right here and here. Those are all areas of ecchymosis, again, blunt force trauma.
States 8 from the composite.
Again, the left arm. Just from a little bit of a different angle, so you can see, and a little bit with the elbow too here, but you can see all these areas, ecchymosis.
States 9 from the composite.
And now looking at the left hand, a little bit closer up, so you can kind of see a little bit better these areas of ecchymosis.
States 10 from the composite.
And again, the left hand just closer up.
States 11 from the composite.
So now we're looking at the back, and you can see that there are these linear abrasions in the mid-back.
Are those scratch marks for?
They could be scratch marks. They could also be blunt impact, more of just a straight-on blunt impact, especially being in that suitcase if there are objects in there.
What is the discoloration that we see around his shoulders and then some other spots on his back as well?
Sure. So you're talking about this area?
Yes.
So that's called livor mortis or lividity, and that's one of the changes that we see, again, after death. And basically what that is it's postmortem, after death, settling of blood in the blood vessels. And so it's dependent on gravity, and it's dependent on the person's position. So what I mean by that is we're seeing it on his back because after the time of death, at some point in time, he was more positioned on his back. And the areas that are lighter, that's because for a couple of reasons. It could be the position of the body, meaning that it's not in the gravity dependent position, or there could be something pressing on it. So either one of those.
States 12 from the composite.
So those are those linear abrasions just shown a little bit closer up.
States 13 from the composite.
And the same, but with a scale.
States 14 from the composite.
So now you're seeing the left side of his back and also the back of his left arm. And you can see these areas here of ecchymoses, and these are a lot darker than some of the others that we've seen. One of the things that I did is I looked underneath the skin in these areas because they're so much darker and so much more dense. So I wanted to see if there was injury of the deeper tissues. So these areas are associated with hemorrhage or bleeding into the skeletal muscle, so the deeper tissues. And so that's just indicating more force applied to that area.
And when you did your internal exam, did you examine this area and did that inform your findings?
Yes.
States 15 from the composite.
And that's showing those areas a little bit closer up. So you can see that they're much more dense. There's at least 3 distinct areas here. There could be more than 3 impacts, but there's at least 3 separate ones that can be seen.
States 16 from the composite.
This is just showing the upper back and the back of the neck. We've got a linear abrasion right here on the back of the neck, and these were the ones shown in the earlier pictures.
And states 17 from the composite.
And this is just showing the same area of the back and the back of the arm, but just at a different angle.
So we've discussed and seen evidence of many different injuries. In total, how many blunt impact injuries did you identify?
I can't give you an exact number. Again, you can have multiple impacts in a very close area, so it can be hard to discern each one. They can overlay each other, or they can be so close to each other. But at least 5 to 6, most likely more than that.
And when you were going through your body chart as well, and I guess we also saw some of it photographically, You also mentioned impact to the left side of the head.
Yes.
And I believe that was subgaleal?
Subgaleal, so kind of similar to what I was describing on the back. I looked at the underside of the scalp. And so in those areas on the left side of his forehead where there was the edema, when we reflect or we fold the scalp over, there was hemorrhage or bleeding that went through the entire scalp and was deposited on the skull. There was no associated skull fracture, and there was no bleeding inside of the skull, but it was all in the scalp and deposited on the outer surface of the skull.
So under the skin, but not under the skull?
Correct.
Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you. Any cross-examination?
Yes. Doctor, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is James Owens, and I'm one of the lawyers that represents Sarah Boone here today. And I've got 2 questions. Can we first talk about the toxicology?
Yes.
The alcohol. You said you've done approximately 3,000 autopsies. And of those autopsies, how many years would that have been over that period of time?
12 years.
Okay. So when you first got down here from Tampa, I think you were up in the Northeast, came down here to Tampa, that's when you started?
Yes.
And you would agree you've interpreted toxicology results in all or most of those cases?
Most, yes.
And you did order the blood alcohol test of the decedent in this case? And you said he was a .38?
No, 0.138.
0.138. And you also ordered the vitreous level
Yes.
of alcohol as well? And the result was a .213?
Yes.
And you would agree that's about 3 times the legal limit?
Close, yes.
Now, you would agree that at those levels there are some pharmacologic effects from ethanol in the body?
Yes.
And I know you mentioned some, but you agree that that level of alcohol in the body would impair somebody's judgment?
For most people, yes.
And their decision-making abilities?
Yes.
And it would release inhibitions?
Yes.
And they would be more apt to take risk that they otherwise would not?
Yes.
And of course, it would impair motor skills and potentially loss of balance?
Yes.
It would also impair coordination?
Yes.
Hand-eye coordination as well as fine motor skills?
Yes.
It also impairs memory, alcohol does.
Yes.
So there are lots of effects that ethanol has on the body.
Yes.
Now, you're aware in this case that George Torres, the decedent, stepped into the suitcase under his own power in a game of hide and seek.
That's how it was reported to me, yes.
Do you have any evidence to dispute that?
No.
Can you tell us when Mr. Torres drank the last drink he had prior to getting in the suitcase?
That I can't tell you because, if somebody had been drinking either periodically throughout a time period or continually throughout a time period, that's difficult to say.
So he could have stopped drinking an hour before he got into the suitcase, or 5 minutes before he got into the suitcase, or 4 hours before he got into the suitcase.
Yes.
We just don't know.
Correct.
Do you have any idea at the time of the autopsy whether or not he was in the elimination phase?
So
Metabolism.
he was in the metabolic phase, yes.
The elimination phase is what I refer to it as, but
Yes.
okay. All right, now I want to talk about time of death determination. It's fair to say that you did not go to the scene that day that Mr. Torres was found.
No, a medical legal death investigator from our office went to the scene.
So there was an investigator with your agency named Ashley Hammermeister
Yes.
that went to the scene,
Yes.
and she would have prepared a report.
Yes.
And you would have reviewed that report.
Yes.
Do you agree that Fire and Rescue assessed Mr. Torres at 1:07 p.m. on that date, February 24th of 2020?
Yes.
Does that sound about right based on your case file?
Yes.
And so this investigator that we mentioned, she did not arrive on scene till 6:27 p.m., so nearly 6 hours after the body was discovered, she arrived.
Yes.
And the body was laying supine, stretched out
Yes.
in front of the suitcase.
Yes.
Now, you examined and assessed the body of Mr. Torres at the time of the autopsy,
Yes.
and you said that the body was ambient temperature.
Yes.
Is that the normal air temperature we're in today?
Whichever environment you're in, yes.
So the body was not stored in a cooler for 24 hours.
No, the body was stored in the cooler, but in the mornings when we get there, the bodies are brought out of the cooler.
Okay. How long had the body been out of the cooler before it was examined by you? Do you know?
Most likely an hour to an hour and a half.
Now, you said that the lividity was in the back, correct?
There's lividity in the back and also on the left side of the body as well.
And you agree the body is stored at the morgue on its back?
Correct.
Now, were you aware of the last time that Miss Boone, my client, actually saw her boyfriend alive or observed him in the video, in the suitcase by video from her phone?
I think in the report it was around 12:30 or 1 in the morning, somewhere around there.
Have you looked at either one of those videos from her phone?
I briefly saw one that the detective showed me.
Do you know if that was the 2-minute video or the 20-second video?
I believe it was the shorter one.
Okay. So would it be fair if I said the time last seen was around 11:30? Would you dispute that or?
No.
Okay. So really, from the time, I guess it was 11:30 that evening with the videos, and then you understood that the body was found around 12 hours later the next day or so. Would you agree that the death occurred sometime within those two periods of time?
Yes.
We don't know exactly when that is. So
Yeah.
it would be a guess if we tried to speculate about that.
Yes.
Now, considering the 3,000 autopsies, how many cases have you ruled the cause of death as positional or postural asphyxia?
A handful of times. It's not very common.
So about 5 times or less?
Yes.
And we're going to talk about environmental suffocation in a little bit, but let's talk about this positional asphyxia component. What was your ruling in those 5 cases that you ruled that it was positional asphyxia? What was your ruling in terms of your diagnosis?
Your Honor, I'm going to object as to relevance.
Approach. The objection is sustained.
Doctor, you're familiar with Dr. DeMaio, Vincent DeMaio's textbook of forensic pathology.
Yes.
Would you agree that that's authoritative?
I'm sorry?
Would you agree that's authoritative, a well-accepted book?
Yes.
Environmental suffocation is a lack of oxygen. You would agree?
Yes.
Now, how many of those cases of the 3,000 that you've done where you found environmental suffocation?
Probably 2 to 3.
So very few?
Yes.
In a positional asphyxia case, that's kind of an example, like you get stuck in a hole and as you breathe, you sink deeper into the hole, or it tightens.
It can be anything that impairs the actual physical aspect of breathing. So that could be if the neck is flexed very much forward, and so that way cutting off the air supply up towards the top of the head. That could be something compressing around the torso, so not being able to take a full breath. So those are examples of
Or another example may be falling out of a tree stand and getting suspended upside down,
yes.
or the majority of the blood gets in the top half of the body.
Yes.
Would you agree in those type situations that the deaths occur fairly quickly, usually within an hour?
They can. It depends again on the situation.
Now, you said Mr. Torres was 5'2" and 103 pounds?
Yes.
Do you know how big the suitcase was that Mr. Torres was in?
I don't have the exact measurements with me.
So if I told you the measurements, you wouldn't know one way or the other what they were?
No, I think they were described to me, and I saw the pictures from the scene, and I was able to review crime scene photos to see what the actual suitcase was like.
Okay. Do you know the crown to rump length of Mr. Torres?
No,
Did you do any demonstrative study on the suitcase to determine what kind of spacing he would have inside that enclosure?
no,
And you don't know the position that Mr. Torres or his orientation at the time that he was in the suitcase was?
Again, I favor a fetal position, but again, I didn't observe him in the suitcase.
Okay. But you don't know exactly what the positional component was that caused, or what led you to believe caused his death?
Correct. I mean, based on his stature and what the suitcase was, he would have had to have flexed at the hips and knees to be able to fit into the suitcase.
So based on what you've said, you would agree you didn't know how much Mr. Torres would have been able to move and stretch his various extremities inside the suitcase, do you?
No,
So you would agree that his repositioning inside the suitcase would have been easier if he didn't have so much alcohol in his bloodstream?
I don't know that I would agree with that.
Excuse me?
I don't know that I would agree with that.
Well, you said his fine motor skills would be impaired by the alcohol.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought you meant his ability to just move.
To reposition himself inside this, that would be limited to some degree by the alcohol he consumed.
It could be. I mean, that's not really a fine motor skill. But
Okay. Or the use of his hands to unzip the suitcase would
Sure.
be affected by the alcohol that he had consumed.
Sure, that could be.
Okay. Now, the environmental suffocation deals with the lack of oxygen.
Yes.
Correct? And due to that insufficient oxygen that we breathe in the air, so you essentially run out of the oxygen in the space.
Yes.
So I guess the years ago, how this sometimes would occur was a child would somehow get into an old refrigerator and it would be enclosed, so it was airtight, and eventually you would run out of oxygen.
Yes.
You would agree with that?
Yes.
And I think you said the normal makeup of air has about 20% oxygen.
Yes.
So we had either a decrease in the oxygen levels or a low concentration of oxygen.
Yes. Yes. And also, keep in mind that while he's in there, every time he's exhaling, he's pushing out carbon dioxide. Okay, so again, whatever oxygen is there is most likely diminished because it is an enclosed space. It doesn't have to be no oxygen, but it's decreased from what we would have in a normal room. But every time that he's exhaling, there's more carbon dioxide that's in that space as well. So that displaces any oxygen that might be there too.
So what volume of air do we inhale and exhale in a normal breath at us?
Well, it depends. I mean, you can take a deep breath, you can take a shallow breath. It depends. And then there's also the rate at which people breathe. So that's variable.
So if it was average, would you say 500 milliliters on average?
Depends on the person.
Well, would you agree that at rest, you take a normal number of breaths per minute of 12 to 14?
That would be considered the normal range, yes.
So 6 to 7 liters per minute
Yes.
at rest? Do you know the volume of room air contained in that suitcase?
No.
Do you know how porous the fabric of that suitcase was?
No.
Did you run any tests on the suitcase?
No.
Were you aware that the suitcase, the lock on it or the zipper on it was broken? The pull handles were broken?
Yes, I did know that.
Do you agree if there is a portion of the zipper that's open that air can travel in and out of that space?
Yes.
Do you know what the anticipated exchange of gases would be through that fabric?
No.
Do you know if, the suitcase was out in the rain and it rained, do you know whether or not rain or the liquid would pierce the interior?
I don't know.
So from what I gather, no studies were done on the suitcase.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. So we don't know that zipper being busted, what exchange of air could go in and out.
Correct.
I think you said there are physiological effects once the value or percentage of oxygen is decreased from the norm. You
Yes.
said 8 to 10% you become unconscious,
Yes.
and then a value of less than 8% death occurs.
For most people, yes.
Excuse me?
For most people,
And the normal oxygen saturation in adults and children is 95 to 100%.
yes.
So if it decreases, the oxygen decreases less than 10%, someone would lose consciousness and die within less than 30 minutes.
So that's hard to give a time frame on that. Studies that have been done shown if the oxygen, content is anywhere from 4 to 6, unconsciousness can occur in less than a minute, death within minutes. But those have been empirical studies.
So, and I know that's kind of, maybe you tell me, if that's kind of why you gave the two different diagnoses, the environmental and the positional, is because the environmental may have had an effect or the positional may have had an effect. You're not sure, so you listed them both.
It's not that I'm not sure. I think that both mechanisms were at play at the same time, and that's not unusual in deaths, is there can be multiple factors occurring at the same time.
But you don't know the percentages, 50% for one or 70% for one, 30 for the other. You don't know.
No.
But you would agree in concert, if these two causes, the positional as well as the environmental, if they were acting in concert, that would render a relatively short amount of survival time.
I can't say.
You just don't know.
No.
Now, we talked about these blunt force injuries, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Would it be fair to the jury to say that there were no broken bones?
There were no broken bones.
And it would be fair to say that the blunt force injuries on his body that the jury has seen here today did not contribute to the cause of his death.
Not likely.
And I think you didn't put that anywhere in your report. That it
No.
did not,
I included it in my report. I did not include it on the death certificate.
as the reason or cause, contributing cause of the death.
Correct.
Judge, can I put up a couple of those
Yes, sir.
exhibits? Doctor, are you aware that there was a baseball bat that was gathered in evidence in this case?
I didn't hear about that until later.
When is later? When did you first learn about the potential of baseball?
That might have been around the time that I was sitting for a deposition, but I can't quite
You know when your
remember.
deposition was taken?
I don't have the file folder. I don't know when I was deposed.
I'm going to show you this exhibit. This is it's number 14. And this composite exhibit is State's exhibit, I believe, number 13. And this is picture number 14. You see the, you said they were circular type injuries.
Yes.
And you've seen a regular baseball bat or a kid's baseball bat.
Yes.
A wooden bat. And if you were to swing that bat and hit somebody's body or hit a suitcase and the blunt force, that would be a linear line across that person.
It could be depending on the position of the body, the position of the suitcase, and the position or how the object came in contact.
What is a linear injury mean?
So linear injury is, if you think, linear, it's more like a line.
Okay. Now, if you took the barrel of the bat, the very end of the barrel of the bat, and you poked into the suitcase with the barrel of that bat, would those spots there in this exhibit, is that consistent?
That's compatible with that, yes.
Excuse me?
That's compatible.
And then here's a close-up. This is picture picture number 15. Again, a close-up, same question. Would that be consistent with poking the suitcase, if he's in the suitcase at the time, thrusting the barrel of that bat, the crown of that bat, would potentially run those type injuries?
Yes, it's compatible with that.
Now, I want to draw your attention to the cardiovascular system. Do you have your report?
I do.
Okay. You describe the proximal third of the left anterior descending coronary artery having greater than a 75% narrowing of the lumen due to its centrically placed firm yellow-white fibrolipid atherosclerotic plaque.
Yes.
And is that pretty much verbatim with what you said in the report?
Yes.
Okay. And that terminology is synonymous with a single vessel high-grade atherosclerotic coronary artery disease.
Yes.
And in that location, it's kind of a classic location for what people refer to as the widowmaker,
Yes.
because of the location in that vessel that supplies most of the circulation to the left ventricle.
Yes.
If you had a spasm in that artery, that could nearly totally obstruct the lumen and cause a fatal heart attack, could it not?
It could. It could cause a dysrhythmia, yes.
I'm sorry?
A dysrhythmia or an abnormal beating of the heart.
But that could kill him.
It could.
The lumen is the inside space of the tubular structure?
Yes.
Of that, and so that was blocked, over 75%.
It was. But there was no evidence of myocardial scarring. So when the vessels become blocked, you prevent blood from getting to the muscle of the heart. So there was no evidence that there was any scarring. There was no evidence that there was anything that happened acutely. When that happens, we can see changes in the actual muscle of the heart. So there were no changes suggestive of that.
Well, let me ask you something. If he were to get out of the suitcase on his own, and he would have passed out or fell asleep on the couch, and she would have woken up the next day about that time and came down, and he was dead on the couch, and you did this autopsy, would it be fair to say that in your ruling on cause of death, that single vessel coronary artery atherosclerosis would be your probable cause of death?
It could be, but any sort of injury overrides natural disease if the injury is significant, right? So you don't have to be a perfectly healthy person to have trauma and die. So it's very common that we see people that have injuries for whatever reason, but also have a lot of natural disease. But we look at it as the injuries override the natural disease because especially atherosclerotic disease, that's considered long-term. Right? So that's been going on for years and years. People walk around with that all the time. So what's different is that we have trauma, and so that overrides natural disease. And sometimes natural disease can contribute, but again, it depends on the individual. It depends on the circumstances.
So absent the positional asphyxia or the environmental asphyxia, and he was dead, and you did the autopsy, it would be fair to say that you would determine this was a natural death from an isolated coronary heart disease, would you not?
It would depend on the circumstances. And I can't speculate on this case because I know what I know about
If
it.
you had nothing else, the widowmaker would have caused his death, or you would have to have assumed, having nothing else, that would have caused his death.
I most likely would have given him cardiovascular disease.
Now, this ethanol metabolism that we talked about earlier, and there's a question about you believing he was in the elimination phase, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is it fair to say that George Torres, the decedent, was in the elimination phase since the blood ethanol was below the vitreous value?
Yes.
Given the vitreous value was 213, is it justified in saying the decedent's blood ethanol level was at least a .213 prior to starting the elimination phase?
Yes.
And now you know that the normal elimination rate is, I believe, 0.015% per hour?
Yes.
Is that standard?
It's an estimate.
And so we have a difference of a .138 to the 213. So roughly 5 hours of elimination. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
So in other words, you would agree there's a short interval where the vitreous and the blood are identical.
Yes.
And then the blood drops beneath the vitreous value as ethanol is metabolized in the blood.
Yes.
So is it fair to say, given the significant difference in the blood and the vitreous ethanol values, that the true vitreous and blood ethanol level had to be much higher than what is reported in your report at the time that he passed?
At the time that he passed? No, this is reflective of the time that he passed.
Say again?
This is reflective, the .139, that's reflective of the time that he passed. There's not metabolism after death of the alcohol.
All right. Well, let me. What I'm saying is, he could have been prior to that time of passing. He could have his blood alcohol level would have been much higher.
It was at least at the same level as the
At least the
vitreous.
two.
Yes.
At least the 213.
Yes.
But could have been much higher.
It could have been, yes.
It was pre-marked as defense J, will be received into evidence without objection as defense 1.
Ma'am, there's 5 photographs. I'm just confirming the optimal. The first one is number 5. What does this depict?
So that's the left hand. So you're looking at the outer surface of the hand, the knuckles, and 3 of the fingers.
Bruise there on his top of his left hand?
Yes.
Right, and the same for picture number 4.
So that's the same, just a little bit further away and without a scale.
And then here is picture number 3.
So now you're looking at the thumb and the index finger?
And then it shows some bruising on the hand.
Yes.
And then here's picture number 2.
So what you're seeing here is, from the scene, our investigators put brown bags over the decedent's hands, and that's, we collect evidence at the time of the autopsy. So at the scene, brown bags are put on the hands to preserve any evidence. And so that's why you're seeing this, because this is a picture that we take. We cut the bag open, and we take a picture to show exactly what the hands look like.
You agree there's the bruising here on
Yes,
the
there.
hand, and also up around the knuckle area?
Yes.
The fingers, and also on the section here?
Yes.
And then here's the last picture, number 5, which again is the left hand,
Yes.
showing the bruising on the top of the hand as well as the knuckle area.
Yes.
Thank you, Doctor.
Any redirect examination? You may proceed.
You were asked several questions on cross-examination about the alcohol level in this case. And I believe there was a term, metabolic phase or elimination phase. Could you just explain for us what that is?
Sure. So in the toxicology testing, there's 2 different levels that I ordered for levels of alcohol. One is they look in the blood to see the level of alcohol. The other is in what's called vitreous fluid or eye fluid. And we look at both areas because that can give us an idea of whether somebody is metabolizing through the alcohol or whether it's still rising. It just gives us an idea sometimes of how close to death they were when the ingestion of alcohol happened. But basically, the level in the eye fluid trails behind what we see in the blood. There will be a small point in time, as we discussed earlier, that they will be almost the same. But you can just think of it as the blood alcohol goes up, And then a brief period of time later, the alcohol in the eye fluid will start to show. So again, it's just to give us an idea of whether somebody is metabolizing or whether they're still, the level is still rising, or if they're still, intaking alcohol.
So the result in this case was indicative that George Torres's level was coming down.
Yes.
And I think some of the math was a little bit difficult to follow on the fly. But with that rate of dissipation, would it be fair to say that he would have been in that suitcase for approximately 5 hours? Because he couldn't be drinking whilst in the suitcase, that we're seeing this rate decrease between these two levels.
Well, you have to be careful how you interpret it, because, the numbers that I have from toxicology testing, that's from one point in time, right? We're collecting those specimens at the time of the autopsy. So that's only one point in time. It's possible, but I can't say for certain. All I can tell you is that at some point in time, his blood alcohol was at least the higher level that we saw in the vitreous fluid. So if, the calculation of the 5 hours, that's an estimate, because again, everyone's a little bit different. But I think it's reasonable to say 5 hours. Yes, that's within reason to say that.
And obviously a pretty obvious point, but we don't continue to metabolize alcohol after death?
Correct.
You were asked about studies or tests being performed on the suitcase in this case.
Correct.
Would the presence of objects in that suitcase also affect the length of time a person may have survived in that suitcase?
I guess if there were a lot of other objects in there, that maybe could, occlude the mouth or nose, or maybe if that means if there's more stuff in the suitcase, there's less room for the person. So I guess.
Another variable that would also be present would be the opening of that zipper, would it not?
Yes.
So if the zipper was further open, potentially more oxygen could be coming into that area. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, there could be more oxygen coming in, but that's always the question is, would it be enough? Right? Because you can still have oxygen there, but it may not be enough. And again, for that I talked about before.
And there would be no way to know exactly how far that zipper was potentially forced open.
Correct.
I have no further questions.
Can this witness be released?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Judge.
All right, thank you, ma'am.